two stories on Spaceship Earth, a passenger story and a crew story. The passenger story is based on extraction, transaction and distraction. It's a passive story of more, about individuals and separate selves, and it turns out the story is incompatible with how the spaceship works. It's dividing us and destroying life, taking us towards collapse. The crew story is based on connection, cooperation, participation and regeneration. It's an active story of community, human and more than human. The crew story invites us to find our unique place of service on board the spaceship, becoming crew on Spaceship Earth. You're listening to the Spaceship Earth Podcast with me, Dan Burgess. We live on a life-giving rock called Earth, hurtling through space. Like a spaceship, we have a finite amount of supplies with an intelligent operating system called nature, which keeps everything replenished as long as we all respect and participate wisely. In this podcast, I'm in conversation with humans involved in regenerating life, shifting consciousness and reimagining how we can live more beautifully and peacefully. I talk with artists, writers, activists, designers, adventurers, healers, farmers, creative mavericks and more. Their stories invite us to participate in the co-creation of life-sustaining cultures, in service to life, becoming crew on Spaceship Earth. Greetings, Earthling. This is Dan. Welcome to the Spaceship Earth Podcast. Thank you for tuning in. If you're new to this podcast, thank you for checking us out. If you're a regular listener, you'll know that we've been quiet for a few months. We've been contemplating our place within the universe, our purpose within these extraordinary times that we're living in, and I think we can pretty much guarantee 2024 will continue with the extraordinary, overwhelming, mind-boggling state of affairs that we're getting used to. Yeah, we've been really taking a bit of time to think about what next, and because these times are extraordinary. And personally, I've been trying to figure out how to continue with the podcast. I love this podcast. It's been going since 2018. I started this, so this is its sixth year. It's an organic vibe here on the Spaceship Earth. We ebb and flow with life. We're a tiny little setup. We're completely self-funded, or have been until this point. More on that shortly. And I just figured out we've actually released 100 episodes, and about 70, nearly 80 of those have been longer form conversations, and then there's a bunch of music mixes and poems and short stories and experimental episodes that we've also put out. So, and that's quite nuts, isn't it? And it's these conversations, these inquiries I'm having on this podcast, the guests that we're bringing in, the projects, the ideas, the insights, the inspiration, I think are really, for me, have been incredibly nourishing. And the feedback I get from you listeners has been the same. And that's what keeps me going, keeps us wanting to do this podcast. It feels like as our sort of mainstream media, our mainstream narratives become, in many ways to me, more and more limiting, as more and more unravels around us, that podcasts like the Spaceship Earth, and there are many others that are trying to explore and open up different ways of thinking about the future that is unfolding, different ways of thinking about how we organize ourselves, how we design our human systems when so much is falling apart. Conversations that are honest and vulnerable and open and don't claim to have solid answers, but are willing to kind of hold space for not knowing and complexity and connection, humility. These feel to me and to us here important, really important. But let's be honest, putting these podcasts out is a lot of work. It requires a lot of time. It requires money. And to date, we have self-funded all of that through the work that I'm doing out in the world, and we fund the podcast. But over time, that's becoming more difficult to do, to carve out the time to record these conversations, to host them, to put them out, to communicate them, to do all the stuff that you have to do each time you create an episode. Yeah, it costs hundreds of pounds every month to do this. I don't receive anything. And that's kind of worked-ish, but we're at a point now where this year we want to ramp up the podcast, not to some kind of insane level, but to be recording every week, to be putting a couple of episodes out a month, and also on the growing community around the podcast, becoming crew, developing more community offerings. We've been writing more and more on Substack. So here's the thing. We need you. We are going to make a couple of shifts this year with the podcast. And we need our listeners to become more involved to make this thing work. So the first thing we're going to do is we will be moving the podcast to Substack. Now, that doesn't change anything for you, the listener. You can still listen to the podcast through all your usual podcast providers, Apple, Spotify, whatever it is you use to listen to podcasts. That remains the same. But we will be hosting on Substack. Now, Substack is somewhere where I've been writing for a few years or experimenting with writing. It's called becomingcrew.substack.com. And we have also been running a irregular newsletter off the Substack for the podcast. And it's a really cool platform for writers and creators. And if you subscribe to our Substack, which just requires you sticking your email in to date, every time we post an episode or post a bit of writing, it goes into your email inbox. And there's a really interesting community building around Substacks. So anyway, a couple of years ago, they started allowing podcasters to host via Substack. And I've been watching that and had my eye on that for a while. And now feels about the right time to move everything over to Substack. So what does that mean for you? Well, hopefully what it means is you will subscribe to the podcast on Substack. So on our Substack, it will be the Spaceship Earth Podcast plus the Becoming Crew community, where we write and offer up various community offerings. And as I say, to date, that's been free. And most of the content will continue to be free, but we are asking our listeners whether they would be willing to contribute to the costs of the podcast. So there's a range of monthly or one-off payments that you can make. Now, I think the average payment is going to be about the cost of a pint of British beer in a pub or 2 takeaway coffees. So a monthly payment of a pint of beer or 2 coffees or teas would support the costs of recording, hosting, distributing this podcast, the writing that we're doing around the podcast, and supporting a bunch of community offerings that we're also looking to develop around the episodes. So that's really what we're asking of listeners, whether you can afford to do that to support the future this year of what we're trying to do. I know things are tight for everyone, so appreciate that might not work for everyone, but if you can substitute that pint of beer or those 2 coffees, you will be part of this growing crew supporting the podcast and participating in all kinds of awesome change. And that would really help us to continue to put this podcast out, support a small crew of folk that are helping to make this podcast a reality. And yeah, that's the plan. So if that feels like something you'd like to do, head over to becomingcrew.substack.com and subscribe and pick the offer that you are most able to do. Like I said, you'll still be able to receive the podcast for free. We're not going to stop doing that. There will be some stuff that will be just for paying subscribers. But yeah, whatever you can do, we would massively appreciate it. It would really help us to continue to do this. So that's the main thing I wanted to share. This was a little short episode just to give you a heads up that that's what we're doing, and your support, your participation in this project is essential if it's going to continue. And then I guess the other thing, if you can't offer any kind of payment, in the spirit of reciprocity, I guess is what we're getting to with all of this, is there's this kind of circle of reciprocity, which is kind of how life on Spaceship Earth appears to work. We give and we receive, and so if you can't contribute any financial support to the podcast, there's lots of other stuff. Getting involved, leaving some comments on each episode, starting conversations on the Substack around stuff that's got your attention or you're finding interesting in some of the things that we're exploring. Sharing podcasts, sharing stuff with other friends that you think might like this podcast or might enjoy a conversation, giving us a rating or a review on your podcast provider. All of this stuff, it really helps create energy around what we're doing and brings more people in. And this thing, in the spirit of becoming crew, it needs more participation, more active participation from listeners and supporters. And we have all kinds of things that we're contemplating opening up to listeners, community gatherings, spaces for reflection, conversations with guests, and lots of other stuff. But we kind of need to feel that support from listeners for this stuff to roll forward in 2024. So I shall stop there because that's been a bit of a long ramble. So yeah, there are new episodes dropping very shortly. We've got some amazing people that are coming to join the podcast this year, doing like absolutely extraordinary things on Spaceship Earth right now, and offering us all kinds of insight and intelligence and inspiration and offerings to help us all step into service right now and start to bring life back. This is, as I said, extraordinary times we're in. I think we can guarantee 24 will continue to be pretty out there. So yeah, we need each other. We need community. We need connection, human and more than human. And that's really what we're trying to do here with the podcast and the Becoming Crew community. So yeah, if that feels like something you'd like to join us with this year, then get on over to becomingcrew.substack.com if you can, to subscribe to one of the supporting options that would help us with the ongoing costs of doing this work. And jump into all the many ways to get involved. We'd love to hear from you. So until next time, the first new episode of the year is coming very shortly. Until next time, peace and out.
This podcast is created in service to life, for you. It takes time, funds and energy to make. If you'd like to contribute to the running costs, you can donate the price of a cuppa or a pint. Find the link on our website. This podcast wouldn't exist without the following crew: Charlie Shred, Audio Jedi; Seaman Home Burgess, Engine Room; Willow Burgess, Jingles;